Hello, I'm Chris Buist. I'm from Coleago Consulting, and I'm going to be talking about recent trends in managed services and what that means for operators and MSPs going forwards. So I'm just going to start by introducing myself and a bit about Coleago. So I've been in the telecoms industry since the early 80s, and my career has sort of followed the main trends of the industry. So in the 80s and 90s, I worked on things like network digitalization, that was moving from analog to digital, for people like BT. Worked a lot in market liberalization, which was about helping operators to win licenses and get operations started. And then since the millennium, a lot of the work has been about fixing all that, which has been about cost reduction, performance improvement, and in particular using managed services and network sharing to solve those sorts of problems. That's why I'm up here today. Now, the reason for really mentioning that is that one of the things I've really enjoyed about telecoms is that every decade is different. And I think this next decade for me, I go back to this morning's presentations actually, it's going to be driven and enabled by SDN and NFV. And one of the things I'll come on to in this presentation towards the end is how that's also going to impact on managed services as well. Just in terms of Coleago, we're a boutique telecoms consultancy. That's another way of saying we're a small telecoms consultancy. We're specialized in certain areas. We do a lot of work in spectrum consultancy. So that's spectrum valuation, spectrum strategy. We're one of the leading consultancies in the world in that area. We do a lot of work in the managed services and network sharing area, which is very much my speciality. And we do a lot of bespoke training. One of the big differences about Coleago is that we don't have any junior consultants. Everybody's got at least 15 years experience. And there are many old people around, like myself, with sort of 25 to 30 years experience. And that's one of the things about the training we do. It's very bespoke, but we've got a lot of people with a lot of war stories there, which is great for doing these training. Anyway, that's the end of the sales pitch. So the presentation's in two parts. I'm going to talk about some of the recent trends in managed services, and then move on to what I think the implications are for operators and managed service providers. So MSP is the acronym we use for managed service providers. And as I said, I'll bring it full circle at the end back to the SDN NFV topic. We've had the pleasure of working with European Communications on their survey both last year and this year, and I'm going to weave in some of the respondents' answers into this presentation as well. So just to start in terms of the trends, I'm going to go back in time and do a potted history of managed services, just to sort of set the scene, I suppose. If you want to talk about the modern roots of managed services, then really you go back to the 70s and 80s, and in particular there was a landmark deal in 1989. When Kodak outsourced all their data center operations to IBM. And that's often looked at as being the start of modern managed services, although many deals had been done before that point in time. Now in telecoms, in the 90s, there were a lot of contracts, a lot of turnkey contracts to roll out mobile networks. But really, managed services didn't take off until after the millennium. And there have been three key domains for managed services in telecoms. One has been call centers, where operators have, in a lot of cases, offshored call centers to lower-cost countries like India. Network operations has been another major area. Typically, that's been outsourced to the big global equipment vendors, some of them up there on the slide. And then the third domain has been business support systems. And that's either gone to the big IT, the global outsourcers like IBM and Accenture, or it's gone to more industry expert companies such as Amdocs or Converse. So that's a part of history. That sort of sets the scene. I'm now going to talk about some of the more recent trends. Not all of them, but some of the key ones that I wanted to pick out. So the first one is about why operators use managed services in the first place. And if I go back 10 years, the sort of first decade after the millennium, there was only really one reason people did it, and that was to get the costs down. So long as so long as there's no detrimental impact on performance, let's do it, let's get the costs down. But over the years, everybody has learned, operators and providers, that there's a lot of other reasons for using managed services. And it's reasons like improving customer experience, shortening the time to market, getting access to additional expertise. But the thing is, operators have learned how to quantify all these things now to create the business case for it, taking all these things into account, and tie that all the way through to what's the impact on EBITDA, cash flow, and enterprise value. I think the message here has become for MSPs that cost reduction is a given. How else can you help us? What else can you do for us? And how does that tie into our business objectives? It's become an industry mantra nowadays that really managed services must be driven by and tied back to the business objectives, or they're not going to be successful. So we now look at one of the points from one of the questions in the survey. This really, backs up what I'm just saying. Financial is still the primary driver, the primary objective for people, but now there's some very close also runs to this. So from the survey, from the European Communications Survey, you can see that competitive differentiation, operational efficiency, access to additional expertise, they're almost as important as the cost reduction objective. Time to market and customer experience, they're almost there as well. So these are all now very important. If you'd looked at that graph 10 years ago, there would have been a huge gap between the cost reduction column and all those others. In fact, some of those others wouldn't even have registered on there. So that's the first big change in our view. As I said, the point for the MSPs is very much how else can you help us? And that leads me on to the next point, which is about differentiation and about value add. And you'll have seen the next two graphs in a different format from Mark, but a slightly different interpretation from me, or adding to what he was saying. The first one in terms of, is there sufficient differentiation? So, I think, this is in a way good news for a lot of MSPs, in as much as there's still a lot more opportunity for MSPs to try and differentiate themselves. The important thing is they need to really identify what their value add is, and then even more importantly, they need to be able to communicate it. So that's, for me, is what that first one is about. The second one, I have to admit, is disappointing because, unfortunately, we don't have the information behind it. So has value add been delivered satisfactorily? Well, what are the reasons behind these answers? Is it that the MSPs aren't performing? Or is it that perhaps the operators have the wrong expectations, which I have to say is often the case, actually. This is one of those slides where it's a case of, well, could do a lot better, frankly. There's a lot more work there to be done by the MSPs. So I'll now move on to talk about a number of points which I sort of put together as being, it's to do with operators gaining more experience, and they're becoming far more confident in the use of managed services. The reasons I say that are, one aspect is, Mark talked about the shift back in-house of many services, but there's also a shift from single to multi-sourcing. And that, to me, is an indication of operators becoming more experienced and more confident in their use of managed services. Very often, operator clients ask us, well, should we have a multi-source strategy or a single source strategy? But of course, it's actually a very difficult question to answer and a very long question. Of course, you need a lot of consulting effort to do that. But one of the key criteria for it is, how experienced are they at managing MSPs? Because if they're not experienced, if they don't know how to do that, they really should stick with single sourcing. If they're building up the experience, they know how to do it, then they could get better performance, but they're taking on more risk. That's when you move to multi-sourcing. But I think there is a shift that direction, and that, to me, is indicative of them building up more experience. The other point I'd pick up on here is that operators are starting to understand what partnership means. Now, the key word here is starting. They're only starting to understand what this means. So the box on the right-hand side of that slide talks about the characteristics of a partnership. And I think most people could rattle off those sorts of things. So very often when I talk to an operator and they say, yes, we're looking for a partnership, I say, well, do you know what that means? And they'll come up with these sorts of words. But that's then where it stops. It tends to be all words. They don't know how to put that into action. They don't know how to make it real. So it's the things on the left, what I've called the mechanisms, like governance and the processes and performance management. That's how you encapsulate a partnership. And the tricky thing here is that a partnership develops over time as you build up trust. And these mechanisms on the left-hand side, therefore, have to change over time. So if you take performance management as an example, in a network operations outsourcing, if it's a supplier relationship you want to have, where then you're managing against really detailed network-level KPIs, you're managing to spec, so to speak. That's a supplier relationship. If you want a partnership, then you've got to manage to much higher level, business level KPIs, or what some people call KQIs. So if you're to develop a partnership with somebody, you've got to have that shift in all of these different areas. So there's, I can rattle off similar examples in those other areas. Things will have to change. And either when people enter into a contract, into a managed services contract, they don't anticipate how these things will change. They then get stuck into negotiations at a later date trying to make this all happen. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the implementation of this. So, as I said, the key word here is they're starting to understand what partnership means. There's a long way to go before they really put that into action. The bad news, I'm afraid, as in terms of how I look at it, is that although operators are becoming more experienced and more confident, they're still making the same mistakes. So we've got the survey results there on that slide, last year to this year. Now, to me, in a way, it doesn't matter that they've moved around. There's still the same issues, and they're the same issues that cropped up 10 years ago. So, they're still making the same mistakes. Now, unfortunately, what we don't have is information about, what percentage of contracts these issues are cropping up on or the impact of them. But there is some work that Procter & Gamble have done. I know they're not in telecoms, but this is relevant. There is some work that Procter & Gamble have done, which gives, at least I think, gives you some indication of what might be happening. So Procter & Gamble, I think most people know who they are, big consumer goods company. We all use their products. 80 billion turnover. So they, as you might understand, they do a lot of outsourcing, use a lot of managed services. And they're actually very good at it. They're very, very experienced at it. Now, they did this study a couple of years ago, and what they showed was that anywhere between 15 and 40% of the benefits that they had identified in the business cases were not being delivered. And this is a very big, very experienced company. So, for me, what that means is that there's a lot of operators out there using managed services who I don't think are as experienced as P&G, and therefore they're probably heading towards the top end of that range in terms of the benefits that they're not realizing. So, what I now do is to start to look a bit more forwards in terms of what I think operators and MSPs need to be thinking about, taking into account these trends and some other information. So firstly, operators. So what we've said is that they've got better at identifying what are the reasons for using managed services, for quantifying those benefits. They're getting more experience, they're getting more confidence, but there's still a lot of issues. So really the key thing in our view for operators is that they need to, as I've said there, improve their act. They need to improve their competencies. Now, if you want a performance improvement program, what you need to understand is where are you today, where do you want to get to, and how are you going to do it. There's a model that we use, which was developed at Carnegie Mellon University, and it's a 5-level model, as it shows you on that slide. It's made up of something like 100, almost 100 different practices, as they call it, or competencies. So there's a lot of detail in this. Given the time, I'm obviously not going to go into that. But just to give you, some sort of flavour for this, I'd put Procter & Gamble, for example, as they're somewhere between a 3 and a 4 on this level, probably heading towards a 4. Might even be able to tick that off. Most operators, most network operators, I won't surprise you here, but they're down around level 1 or 2 in most cases. They're really at the early stages in this, in terms of moving up this curve. But this is what operators need to be focusing on. And as I said, we use this framework to assess where an operator is and to identify what their goals are in terms of how they want to move up this curve, and the action plan to make it all happen. So that's operators. I could put up a similar slide for MSPs. Again, there's a Carnegie Mellon model for the MSP perspective on this, but there are also other models like COBIT and CMMI. And also, I would say that most MSPs do have performance improvement programs in place. They are looking at this, and it's certainly one of the criteria that we use when we're helping an operator select an MSP, is what is their performance improvement program. So rather than that, the thing I picked out instead for MSPs is that I think the watchword for MSPs and going forwards is flexibility. Now, when you bear in mind that you've heard a lot of words today, for example, about it's a rapidly changing environment, things are moving on faster, telecoms needs to move faster. You start to understand what's behind my argument here. So, bearing in mind that in telecoms, the cycle time, the product development time, is measured in months, or in some cases, almost years. Telecoms is converging with IT and with media, where the cycle time is measured in days or weeks. So the point here is that telecoms has to speed up. Everybody's got that message, and you've heard words today like, fast fail. This is all about speeding up in telecoms. Now, the implication of that on managed services is that operators need their managed service providers to be able to respond to that. So they need to be able to cope with that change. In fact, ideally what operators need is the ability to dial up and dial down the managed services, turn them off, turn them on, truly flexible. But the big problem, if you think about it, is that most managed services deals are really the other way around. They're really locked down hard. They're very, very specific. If you want to change something, we've got a change process to go through. It's cumbersome, it's laborious, and the other thing that's in the operator's mind all the time is that, this is where the MSP makes all his profits on all these changes. I don't want to make a change. So actually, flexibility means changing the whole of the current model on its head. That's a big problem, that's a big ask, and it's going to take a long while for that one to sink in, I think. As I said, that's the watchword. However, and this is where we go full circle to this morning's conversation, I think that the technology roadmap is going to help here. So I actually think that the impact of NFV and SDN on managed services could be huge, frankly, and will solve this problem of not solve it necessarily, but at least help with this problem of flexibility. The whole idea of NFV is very much around agility and scalability, therefore flexibility. So as networks move towards NFV and SDN, so managed services also are going to become far more, or put it this way, the network can then be purchased more as a managed service in its own right as you make that move. So that's going to be good from this point of view. I think the other thing is that from the MSP's perspective, and we go back to the value add point, it then actually becomes easier for MSPs to add value as you move into the cloud. It's going to be far easier to integrate in other technologies, other services, and therefore to be able to add value, I wouldn't say at no cost, but certainly at low cost into that sort of environment. So I think it's good news then from the operator's point of view. I think it's good news too from the MSP's point of view. There is also, though, I think, the other side of the coin, which is that one of the trends that I didn't mention earlier on is that network MSPs have been moving into the BSS domain and vice versa. And I do think that in moving to NFV SDN, there's going to be, I think it's going to accelerate that movement between the two domains. I also do think, and it might be at odds to some of the people that spoke earlier on, I do think it's also going to lead to new entrants coming into this area. So, I think, put all that together, I think is all actually good news for the operators, and it's a mixture of news for the MSPs, but it's certainly an opportunity. But as I said, I think it's going to be one of the big things for the next decade, not just from the network design and operations perspective, but also from the managed services perspective. So as my mouth is getting dry, and I don't know how I'm doing on time, just to wrap this up, so what I said about the trends were that cost reduction isn't the only objective. It's important that the objectives are linked to the business objectives. Operators are becoming more confident, more experienced, but there's still a lot of issues, and there's probably still a lot of benefits loss that's going on right now. What do people need to do? Operators have got to improve their competencies in managed services. MSPs need to become more flexible, at least have a more flexible approach to these deals. And I do think that with NFV SDN, the move to the cloud, that will have a big impact on managed services and on this perspective of flexibility. So that's it. Thank you all very much. I hope that was of interest.